Okay, so the lecture is not a typical lecture. It's going to be quite interactive. There's a performance element to it. So there are going to be some videos that are going to be played throughout. And also you'll be volunteering and reading the piece. So thank you for that. And if you'd like, we can have maybe like a brief question and answers at the end. All the food that you see here are not for eating because it's been exposed in the air for a while, so just for safety. But you can, if you would like to touch it and, see how it feels. Okay, inspired by الحج. I would like to say Bismillah at the beginning as an intention for the lecture, just like we do before eating. And I'd like to quickly introduce myself or reintroduce myself again, and just ask you, please, if you have your phones, to be on silent. I'd appreciate that. Thank you very much. And my name is Salma Serry. I'm a food history researcher. And I specialize in the history of the Middle East, modern Middle East, so specifically from the time in the 1850s onwards. But oftentimes I find, depending on the subject of the study, that I'll need to go back in time to understand the context, right? Today's lecture is about the history or the different histories of food in Hajj, and how the journey of Hajj itself has influenced the food choices and the food habits and the political and the social and the spiritual element behind food in Hajj. And then we'll also touch upon how certain elements of food has influenced the food cuisine or the food habits and the food ways of how people eat and how people cook and their relationship to food in the local Hijaz region of the Saudi Arabia. We'll start with a brief video. So the video was taken in the early 60s. It was a special commission, and we see it sets the mood for how Hajj was like, and perhaps even until now, the beginning of it and the scenery, and there's a very spiritual element to it. But then fast forward to today, actually this is a couple of years back, and we see the scene in Mina. Queues, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people queuing for food, specifically for al-bake. So as we saw, food is sometimes a struggle, oftentimes a struggle, during Hajj, during traveling in general. Sorry? Al-Bake is a struggle. Before Al-Bake, way before Al-Bake, centuries before that, the struggle was even much harder to procure and get the basic of human necessities. The struggle was not only in procuring food, but also in keeping the food, storing it without spoilage. If you imagine, without electricity, without refrigeration, without access to ice, food spoilage was very common, and there were often a lot of travelers who would travel and describe. They would write down their description of what they saw during Hajj. They would write it down, and they would describe so many people during their, the voyage on board ships or in the caravan on camels. There were a lot of instances of food poisoning, simply because the food would go bad because of the heat or because of seasickness. People wouldn't be able to hold the food right in their stomachs. So it was very common. And then there was the issue of food being stolen. Some of them were quite funny, where certain cases where people would leave some food for a few minutes, come back, and then they would find it disappeared on ships, for example. Some other times it was much more tragic, dramatic, where it would happen with several tons of food in terms of wheat that the caravans from Egypt used to carry from all the way from the 11th century until quite recently, until the early 20th century. There were almost 50,000 camels from Egypt arriving in the Egyptian caravan to Al-Hajj. And out of the 50,000, almost quarter of these would be carrying food. Not just food for procuring or for eating during the voyage itself, but also for gifts for the people of Mecca and Al-Medina. So oftentimes the journey was long, and there were a lot of trouble on the road. There was a lot of instances where thieves would attack these caravans and steal the reservoir of food, of these grains of wheat, because it used to almost be in the weight of a currency back then. And then we've got the issue of beyond the Arabian land and beyond the Arab-speaking and the Muslim nation. Muslims coming from Russia, for example, as noted out in the 19th century by the writer and scholar Eileen Kane. She mentioned that there were a lot of issues with getting halal food, halal meat. So the nutrition back then for them was also very difficult until they were able to reach places and geographies where there were a lot of Muslims and where food was halal. So despite that, despite all the struggle, despite all the problems and the difficulties around food, food still had a very spiritual element to it, and perhaps even just the feeling of not being able to get food and being pushed out of the comfort zone, right? Was a part of the Hajj journey, part of endurance, right? Part of patience, part of this cleansing process that happens to the spirit, and that was often also commented on by these travelers in their memoirs. So, speaking of food and how food used to be difficult, in one way, to elongate the shelf life of food, oftentimes people had, as you can see in front of you on the table, and on the table here as well, and up here, drying elements were very important, because then you'd be able to travel longer and carry the food without it being spoiled easily, but also because of its lighter weight. So first of all, we have the raisins in front of you here. Raisins were very common around the area, very easy to carry, and their sugar level was very sufficient. And of course, dates, you might not have that. But then also beyond dates and raisins from grapes, right? Beyond fruits that are hydrated or dehydrated, can you guess what this is? You have it on the table as well. Not Qamaruddin, it's meat. Yes, so this is dried meat. Exactly, thank you, lahm muqaddad. So they used to call it back then in the Arabian Peninsula as lahm qadid, or dried meat. And the technique was very, very old. It wasn't really specific also to only Arabs, but generally you find it in nomadic cultures, where people would go and travel around. It was the best way to carry meat and make sure that, that it stays longer. And then we got those little fish on the table. They're a little smelly. Drying fish was something that was very, very influenced by the East Asian Muslims, and also by sea trades that used to come all the way from South Asia and reach by the trade in the Indian Ocean world. So drying fish was quite common in seaports, or whenever we see spots and ports around in the region, in the Oman coast, in Yemen, and also in Jeddah. It was quite common for the fishermen to dry the fish, and we have certain cookbooks, most of the cookbooks that were quite old in Saudi, dating from the 1970s until early 1990s, they had mentions of hout nashif, which was dried shark, given shark was quite easily to be obtained in the Red Sea. And of course, we also see this influenced today, until now, in the Javanese cuisine in Saudi Arabia, or al-atbaq al-jawiyya. So we see a lot of influence and use of these dried fish and dried shrimps that were very, very central to the Javanese Muslims who settled, came for pilgrimage, but also came for a better religious lifestyle in general here. And then, any guesses what this is? Thank you. It's very close to ma'moul, but kleja was common in the Najdi areas of the Arabian Peninsula, and we also see a variation of it probably in Kuwait, in Iraq as well. Well, it's still called the same, but perhaps they make it a little bit different. Kleja was mentioned in one Najdi Arab who traveled from the northeast of the kingdom in the 1950s, and he mentioned that he relied very heavily on kleja for energy and for ease of just having something quick to eat and fill up his appetite and get some good energy from it. But now that we're talking a lot about dryness, al-jafaf, there's a lot of jafaf. Why don't we talk about water for a bit and watch this video? This is a silent film from 1928, one of the earliest, if not the earliest, films that were made with scenes of some of the Indonesian Hajjis or pilgrims that traveled by ship. And then he stayed with them, and he would travel around, go around Jeddah, and capture some scenes. The filmographer was Dutch, and so you see a lot of Dutch in here. His name was George Kruger. So he mentions that even carrying 200 liters of water by the saqa, or the profession for getting water from wells around the towns and cities in Al-Hijaz. And these wells were pretty old as well. We've got a number of infrastructure projects that the early Muslim Abbasid and Mamluks were interested in digging around in Al-Hijaz as a way of sadaqah. And we've got a traveler from India in 1930 describing in his memoir that he thinks that this is the best form of sadaqah jariyah, to literally keep the water running and the charity running. He's tasting the water before buying it, pre-COVID. So as you see, water was quite an issue, but then speaking of water, we can't speak about it without Zamzam and Hajj, right? To the right on top of me, you see an example of a bottle that was documented to be carried by African Muslims, described as Sudanese. We don't know if they were Sudanese, in fact, or from somewhere else in Africa. But they used to carry these. These are gourds, or do you know gourd, the vegetable? It's similar to pumpkin. Is this what it's called? Babai? Okay, I'm not familiar with the name, but thank you. So they would carry these with them, and he saw that they were among the very few in 1930, even though there were buses and small cars to transport people from Jeddah to Mecca. They preferred to walk it on foot. And he was very surprised and he found that a very bizarre behavior because of their endurance, right? And he observed that most of them would just carry or hang these bottles. But then when it comes to Zamzam as a souvenir is not something new, right? So back in the early Ottoman times, we see the bottle or the container, it's not really a bottle, a water container all the way to the left has an inscription and some beautiful writings, and it was intended as a gift for those who come back, for those who would welcome the Hajjis coming back from the pilgrimage. And then can you guess where this is, the scene? Mina, thank you, yes. Mina was a very, very interesting place because after people would go about doing their sha'air diniyya and all their duties that they would typically do during Hajj, Mina was the point where everyone camped, Mina and Arafat, right? And so there was a very interesting exchange of trade that used to happen. And it was described all the way from almost the 12th century until the early 20th century as the most central souk, one of the most important temporary, you can think of it as an expo of its time. Now, back in the day, Hajj was very difficult for anyone to just go about and do. One had to have resources. One had to have a lot of money. And so majority of those who would afford easily to travel were merchants, right? So for them to come here and meet other merchants, it was this great point of contact for everyone from all over the world to conduct business when also after the religious responsibilities were done. Mina Bazaar was mentioned and described very, very in amazing details in the 17th century by a Turkish pilgrim called Uliyah Çelebi. and also mentioned in the 1930 by the Indian traveler Ghulam Rasul Muhr. And they mentioned that it was tax-free. It was a tax-free place where people could conduct business and exchange goods and services without having to have taxes, to pay taxes, basically. The most important, and that is all the way from the 17th century, the most important good that used to be sold back there was Bahraini pearls, al-lulu, and followed immediately by Yemeni coffee beans. Now, the coffee beans that you see here and in front of you are not roasted. These are the green raw beans, and this was exactly the way it used to be sold. Roasting had its own ritual, it had its own, and cooking, making the coffee itself, brewing it was an entire ritual. But interestingly enough, coffee at the time was actually banned by Sultan Murad IV in the Ottoman Empire. But it was an unsuccessful ban because during that time, I suppose that was in that was around Murad IV time when he reigned. At the same time, we find descriptions of Yemeni coffee being sold abundantly, of course, with a very high price in Mina Bazaar. For those of people who couldn't come all the way down to Yemen, the closest point was always Mina to be able to distribute the coffee. This is an image from Yemen at the beginning of the century, the beginning of the 20th century, and you see these are coffee beans being spilt. And the Indian writer Rasul Ghulam Muhr, 1930, had a very interesting observation that he saw. People came back on his ship with Yemeni goats as a souvenir. For people, I'm not sure exactly why. I'm gonna still have to look into that. But I thought it was a very interesting observation of how people would gift, their loved ones goats all the way from Yemen and take them back to India from the pilgrimage journey. So as you might have seen in the caravan, some of the camels used to carry people. Some used to carry their luggage and their things that they would need and the caravan would need throughout the journey. But also other camels used to carry, they were commercial, almost commercial camels, used to carry those wheat gifts and these donations in the form of grain from Egypt to the people of Mecca. And so we see a very interesting element, a political dynamic between the Sultan, who used to rule over Egypt and ensure, ever since the Ottomans took control or took part, took control of the region, to make sure that the Sultan exceeds what his previous predecessors, the Egyptian Mamluks, used to also donate and give. So they made sure to gain popularity among the Muslims due to their further distance away, right? I mean, for centuries, people here were so used to the Egyptian proximity, but also as Turkish and Ottomans, they wanted to make sure that there are these very strong ties politically and for people and the Arabian tribes to also guarantee and accept their authority. And in return, the safety and the security of the caravans was held in the hands of the Sharif of Mecca, who orchestrated a network of very strong authority and very strong ties with the other tribes to guarantee the security and safety of the arrival of these caravans from Egypt and also from Damascus. These were the two central caravans. And because, so I mentioned wheat, and you have some wheat in front of you, wheat grain, as well as rice grains as well. Similarly, almost from the 19th century, India and merchants in India used to send gifts to the Holy Land, also in the form of rice instead of wheat. But it wasn't until people used to trade it commercially here in the region that people got accustomed to rice. And now rice is a very, very central dish in the region. We have, this is a part, a snippet from the Indian writer, Ghulam Rasul Meher, who wrote in the 1930s his memoirs. I asked at the beginning, but unfortunately she had to leave. I asked for someone who would volunteer to read a part, a very nice part of his memoir on board the ship that came from India, took off from Karachi and came all the way back then it was India, now Pakistan, and came all the way to Jeddah. It wasn't a special pilgrimage ship, but it used to be a merchant, it was a Dutch ship. So the pilots were Dutch, and also Dutch and British also. And so here we have a description of how he enjoyed a meal of fish for a very long time after they took off, weeks almost, when they entered Yemen, or where they entered the Red Sea and the ship entered, they stopped briefly in an island called Kamran. The island had fishermen, and they would stop by, and he describes that he would stop by they would stop by the big ship that used to be, parked by the island, and then they would sell goods in terms of food. They would sell ice, fish, and chicken, as he said, and also some soda. And interestingly, he mentions on the ship, the soda was cheaper than eggs back then. So who would like to volunteer and read it? Read the part in Arabic? Aklat samak. Any brave souls? Yes, thank you.
مع بدء حركة السفينة بدأت عملية قلي السمك، وفي حوالي الساعة 4 قدم إلي يوسف شاهندار تجار أجرة وطلب مني أن أرافقه إلى كابينته، وهناك جاء بالسمك المقلي الذي تمتعنا بطعمه اللذيذ أنا وإسماعيل والشاهندار عبد الشكور والنائب، بينما كان الحافظ يتولى قلي السمك في الطابق العلوي. كيف أعبر لك عن لذة الطعام ونكهته الطيبة؟ لقد تمتع معنا بهذه الوجبة الإمام وحاجي عبد الجليل ورفاق الحافظ محمد صديق وتاجر مسقط وآخرون، وقد شبعنا كثيرا لدرجة أن بعضنا لم يتمكن من تناول طعام العشاء. واقعة مؤلمة؟ شاهدت واقعة مؤلمة ومحزنة جدا وقت سير السفينة من كامران. كان السواحليون الفقراء من أصحاب المراكب قد حملوا معهم السمك والدجاج والثلج وأشياء أخرى يقومون ببيعها لركاب السفينة، ولما كانوا غير قادرين على الوصول بأنفسهم إلى السفينة فقد كنا نقوم برفع هذه الأشياء عن طريق أكياس كالسلال الصغيرة عقدت في حبال يقوم بإدلائها الحجاج الذين يرغبون في شراء شيء مما يحمله هؤلاء الفقراء، ويرفعون هذه الأكياس إلى السفينة ويخرجون البضائع ثم يضعون قيمة هذه البضائع المحددة في الأكياس ويدلونها مرة أخرى لأصحاب القوارب. وهكذا استمرت عملية البيع والشراء حتى وقت تحرك السفينة. حين انطلقت السفينة بالمسير كان بعض الحجاج قد اشتروا السمك، وبينما كانت السفينة تمضي ببطء كان أصحاب المراكب يمضون أيضا جنبا إلى جنب مع السفينة، إلا أن هؤلاء الحجاج الذين اشتروا السمك لم يدلوا بالأكياس مرة أخرى ليدفعوا قيمة مشترياتهم، وزادت سرعة السفينة وبدأ القلق يظهر على وجوه أصحاب المراكب. فقال إسماعيل بصوت عال: اتركوا الأكياس. وبعد دقيقتين أو 3 وبصعوبة تركوا الأكياس التي وصلت إلى أصحاب المراكب. وعرفنا فيما بعد أن هؤلاء الذين اشتروا السمك لم يضعوا القيمة المقررة، بل وضعوا مبلغا يقل 4 آنات عن القيمة المقررة، مما أدخل السرور. خلاص شيطان.
So what do you think? It mentions an interesting observation of how, to him, he felt very hurt by that because he was a very moral person and his ethical compass was very strong, and especially during a Hajj trip, he thought that was very wrong of people to do, but also as a historian and as someone from today and reading this, you can really understand the description of how people used to get food and the value of food for some people, and also the importance of Hajj and the pilgrims coming on board ships for the local fishermen in Qamran in Yemen, and how sometimes trade was not organized. This was in 1930. So way before supermarkets. You'd literally have the supermarket come to you and you'd bring down a basket, with ropes, and that would be your shopping cart going up and down the ship to get your food. This clip is also from the 1928 film by Kruger, and he shows how camping and food was like, and cooking food was like for among the Indonesian population, the Muslim pilgrims, the Hajis that he traveled with, when they settled in Arafat. So most travelers mentioned having difficulty in cooking because the lack of gas and the lack of wood to turn into coal here. The land does not have forests like India or in other places, and so getting wood for burning was not even easy. Cooking was done in a very organized manner, as you see. In most large groups, you'd have, and different caravans, of course, you'd have a number of designated cooks with their utensils cooking for the entire group. And they would be professional in that sense. Although many travelers complained of the lack of good taste and spices, especially if they come from India. Ghulam Rasul Meher specifically complained about the lack of taste and spices and aromatics But he said that otherwise eating food, as you saw from the fish meal, was such a joyous occasion and an opportunity for people to socialize during Hajj. And as you can imagine, I mean, for a journey that came months ago, you know, back in the 11th century, they would set the caravan starts moving at almost after Ramadan, and then they would arrive in the Holy Lands by the time for Hajj. And so when people stayed for so long, the social element, the communal element was a very interesting part. Yes, they are here for religious purposes, but beyond that, almost after every trip, there was a very strong bond and friendships that came out of Hajj, and specifically from eating together, the act of eating together during Hajj. This image is from 1953. It was taken by a Pakistani photographer commissioned by National Geographic, where he was able to take beautiful pictures of images. You can find them online. And so you see this is a portable stove, yes, used with kerosene or gas. Not gas, I mean, it's a specific type of gas or a petrol gas, that kind of kerosene, yes, exactly. And so cooking with it was very common, and it was easy to travel around. Some images and in some films, you'd see some people just walking around with a bottle and this kerosene. And then the rest they'll have to improvise throughout. Can you guess what the dish is? It's a specific type of rice. Madini. Yes, it's the Madini rice specialty. It's rice here is a very interesting story. We see a lot of dependence on rice and a lot of rice dishes and very specific taste and knowledge of rice. Just yesterday, I saw an ad on TV that said that the rice is aged for 2 years, giving it a really interesting, a very rich taste and aroma. So the rice did not really appear. Of course, we know that rice was here, and it used to be grown in Egypt and Iraq almost from antiquity. But the commercialization of rice didn't start until late 17th century. And before that, wheat used to be the main source, or barley was the main source of grain and carbohydrates in the region. We see that, and we see a lot of influence also from the different populations that came, Muslims that came and settled in the Holy Land, especially in the Hijaz region. And we see the Bukhari rice, for example, is one of the most iconic rice dishes that is famous, that Saudi Arabia is famous for. And it's very influenced by the Bukhari culture. And their history of migration is also very interesting, and the contribution that they had on the local cuisine is very, very vivid and very clear. So wheat and bread making was abundant here back in the day, especially that wheat was easily obtained and found almost for free. Bread was a free item in the streets of Mecca and Medina, thanks to the Egyptian donations from the Sultan to here, and also the spirit of charity that was very abundant in Mecca and Medina. Bakeries used to donate bread for free. The Egyptian government in the 19th century, if you hear of Muhammad Ali of Egypt, he was one of the really very significant figures in the 19th century in the region, and he made sure that he opens up a large hostel or a lodge, if you say, in Mecca called the Takiya, the Egyptian Takiya, where they would they had a large bakery that was in charge of baking thousands and thousands of loaves of bread for the poor of Mecca and Medina, but also for the Hujjaj. And so one of the mentions of travelers in the 1930s that they distributed almost 6,000 loaves of bread on a usual day, and that number was hard for him to estimate during Hajj as well. These bakeries also had, or the Egyptian Takiya specifically, also had a restaurant, and they used to cook rice as well. So there was rice and bread that was delivered or handed out for free almost in the second half of the 19th century until early 20th century. So here when we're talking about the Bukhari culture, a series of expulsions and forced migrations happened in the 1930s up until the 1950s in the region of Central Asia. So the Bukhari people is a large umbrella, a large ethnic umbrella, but under that, there's different origins and different parts and regions of Central Asia that different Uzbeks, different Turkestanis, different Qajaris also used to come from, and a lot of them settled here and they were moved, and they initiated the migration sometimes in a forced way because of their animosity from the Chinese Empire, and also, most importantly, from the Russian communists that were against following religions in general, and specifically there was a number of very hostile persecutions for Muslims in the region. So imagine if there was no Holy Land here. They would not have selected and choose to move here and settle down here. So it's really thanks to the Hajj and the beauty of the Holy Land that embraced refugees from these regions. And from Muslim Russia, we have this tool here. Can you guess what this is? Do you know the name? No, but it does contain liquid. Teapot. Yes, you see a teapot at the top. So this is a Russian tool for brewing tea. It originated in the region of Russia and Central Asia, and also some parts of Turkey. And you see that also in the Ottoman Empire, you see a lot of references to it. It's called the samovar, or samovar. And pilgrims from Russian lands and Muslim Russians, when they moved here, and some of them settled here, and some of them would just move, just for Hajj and come back, large numbers of them would have the samovars. And until now, it can be found in old Hijazi homes, because due to the proximity of the Turkish and Ottoman culture to the Hijaz, and it's the ties and links and the relationship between the Hijaz and the Ottoman Empire that also extended and took cultures and were in conversation with parts of Russia as well. This was an art piece that was exhibited last year in Hay Jamil. Maybe you remember it. It's by a great artist, Fatima Uzdinova, and she basically recollects the memories of her either mother or grandmother, I'm not sure, of traveling to Hajj and the items that she recollects from her memory. And we can't talk about the food here in Hijaz without tamiz, right? Yes, we saw the bakery, the men baking it, but this is a very beautiful illustration of a specific art of stamping and decorating the food. In here, it's just made easier with either a fork, sometimes with their hands, and sometimes they have a specific tool with sort of needles, with which they would stamp the bread before baking it. And the name itself, there's a lot of give and take and back and forth of whether it's Afghani or Uzbek or Bukhari, and it's the beauty of food is that it's easily shared between cultures, and the word tamiz itself is used in Afghanistan, but also the thickness of the bread is found in lands like Uzbekistan and Turkestan, some parts, and all the way into Georgia as well. So you see, because of the Ottoman movement, it influenced the movement of food as well. And finally, I'm going to end the lecture with a stop at globalization and its influence on food. This is from 1953. Now, although Pepsi perhaps is more prominent and more ubiquitous in the region, Coca-Cola managed to sponsor some Hajjis, and this is from the National Geographic photo article. And with globalization, fast food also entered, and it made sense because it was perhaps, and still is, the most convenient way, the most quickest way to get food for cheap, on the go, linking back to the Al-Baik video that we saw at the beginning. This is Al-Tazaj, when they first opened. The very first branch was actually in Mecca in 1990. And of course, until this day, there's a lot of links between, in people's memory, of first coming here and doing Hajj in the 90s and the 2000s, and they remember having Tazaj very clearly, because its proximity to the Haram. And finally, I'd like to end with this video of an American sheikh who is quite angry and bitter because of McDonald's opening in 1994 in Mecca. And to him, it perhaps signifies a lot more than just food. But it's interesting to see one reaction to the symbol, perhaps, of the Western globalization coming to the most holy of lands. He meant kabsa.
With his big pants and his hat on, and he had an attitude. He had an attitude. You know what I'm talking about? You walk in like this, you sort of like limp, when you're walking, right? And you got an attitude like you're angry, right? You're angry with everybody. You're not really angry, but you got this attitude, right?
So that's one reaction. Of course, now it's so easy for us to go, get out of the haram, and then immediately there are like tons of food courts around you with burgers and tacos and shawarma. And perhaps regardless of what the food is, at the end of the day, maybe the history can teach us can make us remember and reflect and have that in mind, the spirituality around it, the journeys and the struggle, but also the different meanings that food can carry beyond just its biological and nutritional value, the commensality around it, the importance of holding the community and the social element, in addition to the political, context that we see from the different relationship between different, different groups and different empires, the relationships between tribes and maintaining security and safety. And at the end of the day, it comes down perhaps to what can food teach us, even if we're having a McDonald's meal, maybe with the intention and some reflection from the past. We can enjoy the McDonald's meal, but from a different lens. If we have that the purification intention and slowing down and enjoying the meal and saying Bismillah at the beginning, and then we can perhaps make it a Hajj food if we want to. Thank you very much for joining me today and going through the lecture till the end. And I'm here if you have any questions or you'd like to discuss. Thank you so much.